Seminar number 10, Cohort Studies. Research is the act of going up alleys to see if they are blind. I think some investigators feel this way when diving into a cohort study. Cohort is the Roman term for a group of soldiers that march together. A cohort study follows subjects over time. The purpose can be descriptive, to describe the incidence of disease or an outcome, or the purpose can be analytic, to analyze associations between predictors and outcomes. This schematic is from the Hulley book. From the population, a sample is chosen and followed over time. Some subjects have a risk factor, others do not. Eventually, the outcome of interest is met at a future date, and it is then determined if the risk factor was associated with developing that outcome. Cohort studies are primarily observational in nature. No intervention is done. It is just observed what happens to subjects over time. It is important to remember the investigator defines the sample and measures predictor variables before any outcomes have occurred. This is the essence of a prospective cohort. For instance, in this 2011 publication from the journal Stroke, investigators wondered whether coffee consumption had anything to do with the occurrence of strokes in women. So 34,670 women were identified and followed since 1997, and their coffee consumption patterns were monitored. The authors concluded that low or no coffee consumption is associated with an increased risk of stroke in women. That is almost 35,000 subjects enrolled, and it took the authors almost 14 years before they were able to publish the findings of their study. That's a long time. That is typical for a cohort. So what is a retrospective cohort? This is where an investigator defines the sample and collects data about predictor variables after the outcomes have occurred. The investigator looks to the past and identifies the study subjects in the past. This is different from a case control and requires a lot more effort because a lot more data and many more subjects need to be examined in order to meet the study goals and complete the study cleanly. In the same way that case control studies use a 2x2 table for analysis, cohort data can also be simplified to a 2x2 table to determine the risk of an outcome. The information from this 2x2 table can then be used to calculate the relative risk. The number of exposed with the outcome over all those exposed divided by those with the outcome without exposure to the risk factor over all without the risk in question. So what are the advantages of a cohort? Well, the time sequence of events can be assessed, and that is the primary strength of a cohort study. A cohort provides information on a range of outcomes. It is possible to measure incidence and risk directly. It is possible to collect detailed information. It is possible to study exposures that are rare. Disadvantages include the fact that the study subjects are not randomized. These are self-selected groups. A cohort requires a relatively long study period, and therefore they can be quite expensive to complete. With rare outcomes, a large sample size is needed. The exposure to the risk factor may actually change over time, and investigators need to consider loss of subjects during the course of their study period. Sometimes we'll come across a study where the study design is defined as a clinical cohort study. What does that mean? That's where a cohort of patients with the same clinical condition is admitted to one or more hospitals. Information collected is what is collected as part of routine care, and that information is used for analysis. The aim is to assess different treatments. It is more representative of real clinical practice than a randomized clinical trial, but much more prone to bias, so be careful when evaluating these clinical cohort studies. If planning on conducting a cohort study, remember these tips. During enrollment, exclude those planning to move, unlikely to return, or have no follow-up contacts. During the follow-up period, make sure you contact subjects periodically by phone, mail, or email, and be sure to measure all important potential confounders at baseline to strengthen inferences. At the conclusion of your cohort study period, you don't want to look back and regret not examining a particular variable which you now recognize to be an important one to your study. In the next seminar, we'll talk about cross-sectional studies.